Well, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Thank you for joining me, and hope everybody's staying healthy and well. We come to chapter 10, and this is the third argument Paul will make with regard to how they are to use their liberties and their rights. And for this, he's going to spin the wheel of time backwards. And he's going to use some time to illustrate from the life of the Hebrews, from their time of leaving Egypt, the wandering in the wilderness, to the time they come up until all but Joshua and Caleb have passed away. To remind the Corinthians that just as with the Hebrews, it will not be God's fault if they fail. They're facing some of the very same challenges in Corinth that the people of God faced as they wandered through the wilderness. The first thing he will do in verse 1 is he will call them brethren. He's a term of endearment. He's trying to address them in a term that pulls them close to himself. And then he will talk about the spiritual guidance that is there. He says, I do not want you to be ignorant, unaware. All our fathers were under the cloud, how they passed through the sea. The passing through the sea had to do with a cloud that covered the children of Israel as they came through the sea. It had to do with their spiritual deliverance and how they passed through on dry land, and not a single foot got wet. It was indicative. It was a sign. It was an illustration of a presence of God's presence, of God's protection, and God's care. And so he reminds them how that God cared for them, and how that 24 hours a day God was with them by the cloud of the pillar of fire. So you have the supernatural guidance, you have the supernatural deliverance. Then you have the supernatural leadership. Baptized in a cloud and a sea. The sea wall on either side, and then Moses, or the cloud, over them. Baptized into Moses is baptized into the rule or the domain of Moses. And this was the dividing line between the rule of Pharaoh and the rule of Moses. It's not baptized inside of Moses, but into Moses' rule or reign. And then you have the spiritual food. Verse 3 will talk about the spiritual food. They ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. What we find is they had supernatural food and supernatural drink. All these were blessings from God. Just as everything we have is a blessing of God. They're manifestations of God's grace, manifestations of God's kindness, acts of God's grace and God's kindness for us. What we find by the spiritual drink is it identifies who the one back up providing their food, their drink, and their clothes and their shoes, who was with them during the wilderness wandering. It was the one we come to know as the Christ. They were not alone. Jesus was with them. So then we come to the lessons that they're supposed to learn. You'd think that a people as blessed as the Hebrews will just fall on their face with gratitude and thankfulness. But instead, they were rebellious and disobedient. All except for Joshua and Caleb are accused of unbelief, in spite of all the open manifestations of God's kindness and God's grace with them. God was not happy with the majority of them, verse 5. So the fall of Egypt, of Exodus, is to stand as an illustration or an example to the very temptation now surrounding the Corinthians. And so he's going to talk about the temptations that are there. In verse 6, he will say, now these things become our example to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. Don't be lustful persons as they were lustful persons. The emphasis on lust makes prominent the sin that so displeased God. He observed the conduct of the Israelites, and under the wondrous stream of blessings showered upon them, instead of rejoicing in them and the blessings God extended to them, they lusted after evil things. They kept lusting, desiring to go back to Egypt. Then verse 7, he again talks about the evil thing of idolatry. Do not become idolatrous. Along with idolatry, he will talk about they rose up, they sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. The idea of rise up to play is to be involved in sexual immorality. By no means join the heathens in their idol worship. Your spiritual knowledge, your spiritual gifts will not protect you. They will not make you secure. And so here, they eat, they drink, they amuse themselves, but they do so at idol celebrations. The very thing the Israelites of old attempted when they feasted upon the offerings that were brought by the golden calf and then rose to play. And then verse 8, do not let sexual immorality, as some of them did, in one day, 23,000 fell. The idea is not become immoral It begins with the attitudes or process and continues with the substitution of other things in God's place and results in immorality. Fornication was a regular practice in connection with such idolatrous separations. And then verse 9, he will say, "Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed by serpents." This is not tempt as to do evil, but tempt as to doubt, tempt as to the uttermost, tempt out of rebellion, to murmur and be dissatisfied. This comes from the appeal, let us go back to Egypt, let us go back to Egypt. You see it in Numbers chapter 21, verses 4 through 6, where they're murmuring and complaining against Moses, and God causes the fiery serpent to come out and to bite them. They loathe the manna, and in Corinth they should forego the heathen enjoyments. But instead of rejoicing in the deliverance through Christ, they were dissatisfied and longing for pagan celebrations. And so here they're just like Israel of old. They are testing God. They're despairing of all that God has given them. They're doubting God and his judgments. And do not grumble. The idea of grumbling and murmuring was the idea that this is against God. Back of all murmuring is murmuring against God, and Moses, his representative. God is no longer trusted. He's charged with leading them in the wrong way. You brought us out of Egypt to the wilderness to die. And the point to the Corinthians is they were complaining about Paul, who voiced the Lord's will to them. And then he will say in verse 11, all these things happened to them as examples. And they were written for admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Paul said, all these stand as examples to all who will pursue the flesh and all who will take their rights and abuse them. They had no right, they had no liberty to take the things that God had given them and turn them into acts of lasciviousness or acts of lust. And so, let them stand as an example. Don't test God. Don't try God. You appreciate God's blessings instead. That's down through verse 11.